Hello everyone, and welcome to our first video lecture here on Unit 5, which is going to be the concept of cellular respiration. So just to begin, if you can look at the little animation that's happening here on your screen, I want to get across to you that photosynthesis, we already had learned the formula for photosynthesis, right? And you can see that down below. 6 CO2 plus 6 water with a little bit of light energy is going to allow us to make a high energy sugar in the form of glucose, C6H12O6, and 6 oxygen molecules. All right, for this process of cellular respiration, it's simply going to be the opposite of the formula for photosynthesis. Well, the products for photosynthesis, glucose and oxygen, are the reactants that we start with. And the products of cellular respiration, particularly carbon dioxide and water, are then the reactants for photosynthesis. So these two equations, all right, or processes, are reliant upon each other. And what I want you to drill into your heads right now is that we focus so much on plants for doing photosynthesis. Well, now for cellular respiration, it's going to be both animals and or plants performing this process. So let's begin. First thing I want to begin with is I do not want you to forget the common factors for both photosynthesis and cellular respiration that we began with on the very first slide for Unit 4. During the process of cellular respiration, the whole goal is to make energy. To do that, you are still going to make use of a hydrogen ion concentration that'll be used to make ATP using the enzyme, once again, ATP synthase. So the manner in which this is going to be completed is going to be almost identical to how it was in photosynthesis. And to get there, to make a gradient, to produce ATP, we will once again have to have redox reactions. Remember, reduction and oxidation. Reduction means gaining electrons and satisfying your electron need. Oxidation means losing or the removal of electrons. So as this occurs, we'll be once again using electron carriers, such as, if you remember, NADPH during the light reactions of photosynthesis. However, we will not see that one used here in cellular respiration. And then we will also have an electron transport chain. This time we'll be focusing on the mitochondria, and we'll have a series of proteins, integral membrane proteins, that will transfer electrons. And in conclusion, for just kind of wrapping up the concepts we don't want to forget about, again, for electron carriers, I had said earlier that these are like empty wheelbarrows. So you can fill them up with electrons and have them become fully charged. And then that would be the reduction part. Or you can then remove the electrons and oxidize them. So we're no longer going to be using NADPH or NADP plus here for cellular respiration. We'll be using two different ones. And this time we're going to be saying NAD plus, all right, can become reduced and become NADH. It's going to be hard not to say that P this time, but we're just going to eliminate it. So NAD plus will accept electrons, become reduced into the form of NADH. And we will also see a second electron carrier used this time. We're going to have something called FAD, which will become FADH2 once it accepts electrons and becomes fully reduced. So these two electron carriers will not be used to make sugar like NADPH was used to make glucose during the Calvin cycle. What we're going to use these two for this time is these will carry the electrons that will actually then be used to create a hydrogen ion gradient. So instead of using these to make sugar like we did similarly in photosynthesis, we'll be using these, you'll see in a couple video lectures, to make the hydrogen ion gradient that is then used to make ATP. Alright, so let's begin with some of the basics. So overview of what we call aerobic cellular respiration. Aerobic means the presence of oxygen. Alright, and we'll come back to this term in another slide or two. So the definition of aerobic cellular respiration is going to be the breakdown of glucose, or sugar, in the presence of oxygen. Alright, now glucose can still be broken down when there's no oxygen present, and that's actually going to be one of the first types of respiration that we learn about. But the one that you and I want to do is actually when we break down glucose in the presence of oxygen. And once again, the overall equation, one glucose molecule, C6H12O6, along with 6 oxygens, so you need 6 oxygens to break down one glucose, is going to yield 6 CO2 plus 6 water. And for us, we're going to make a lot of ATP energy, as well as we're going to release some heat. But the key 3 products I really want you to remember are 6 CO2 per glucose, 6 water molecules per glucose, and a whole bunch of ATP energy that our cells can use to power themselves. Heat, we're going to see, is a byproduct. All right, and a few more details for us to take into account. This reaction is going to be exergonic. We had learned about earlier in the year there are 2 types of reactions, endergonic and exergonic. An exergonic reaction is one that as you break down a molecule, so let's pretend our reactant is glucose. As we break it down, we're releasing energy, and the products, in this instance you can think of it as CO2 and water, have less potential energy than what we started with up here, which would have been glucose in this particular reaction that we're looking at this unit. So as we release energy, we funnel that into ATP, all right, but a lot of that energy we don't get a hold of because we're not 100% efficient. Each glucose molecule is going to provide us with roughly about 38 net ATP. All right, and I'll discuss what net means in our next lecture video. All right, so roughly about 38, give or take. That's what you can get theoretically if you're 100%. All right, but that's really not always going to be the case. Now, of all the potential energy that is in one glucose molecule, most cells only get about 36% of the potential energy stored in one glucose. All right, the rest of that, so this 38 ATP is really only about 36% of the ATPs that, in theory, is stored in that chemical equation for glucose. All right, since, as I said earlier, we're not 100% efficient, the remainder of that energy is lost as heat. So if you put your hand on your forehead right now, regardless if you have a fever or not, you're going to feel heat energy coming off. Well, that is actually energy that you were not able to funnel into an ATP molecule, and now you're giving off as a waste product. So we're not that efficient, all right? Hardly at all, all right? We're actually inefficient. And then finally, it's not just glucose that can be broken down from exergonic reactions in the process of cellular respiration. Your body can also break down fat, protein, and a variety of other tissues if glucose is not readily available. So if someone hasn't eaten in quite some time, let's say someone who does not have access to food, they will actually start to break down the fat in their body, which is long-term energy storage. If they run out of fat, they start to break down protein, which is mainly the muscle, and that's when you would see somebody who's obviously starving. All right, they don't have access to food for whatever reason, and their bodies are actually starting to break down themselves because there's no glucose or sugar being directly fed into their bodies. All right, and lastly, for this first video lecture, there are a variety of different types of organisms out there that use oxygen differently. I just want to cover 3 main types. Those 3 main types are what we call obligate aerobes, obligate anaerobes, and the third is called a facultative aerobe. Now, what's the difference between these 3? For the first here, an obligate aerobe is an organism that requires oxygen in order to make ATP. Right? Generally, obligate aerobes, if you are looking in a liquid environment or a marine environment, they tend to stay towards the top of the liquid because that's where the majority of oxygen is present. So you and I, even though we're not living in a water environment, we are obligate aerobes because if you hold your breath right now, you're not going to be able to hold your breath very long. Even if you did to the point where you passed out, As soon as you passed out, your brain would kick back in, make you start breathing, because you need oxygen to produce enough ATP to survive. So you and I are obligate aerobes. Obligate anaerobes, in essence, they're afraid of oxygen. They hate it. All right? They don't want oxygen anywhere near themselves to make ATP. So generally you would find them at the lower depths of any type of marine environment, because the deeper you go, there's always going to be less and less available oxygen that's dissolved in any type of liquid environment. All right, so a lot of types of ancient bacteria that existed on Earth that are still around today, they're obligate anaerobes because they evolved and learned how not to use oxygen in order to make ATP. And then the last type are what we call facultative aerobes. These are organisms that can go a very long time without oxygen. So you can see them over here in this test tube, that they're all dispersed throughout the tube. All right, but the majority are at the top where you would have the most dissolved oxygen in a liquid, because they do prefer oxygen. However, all right, they can survive without it. They can go back and forth to what we call aerobic respiration or anaerobic respiration. Now, these are going to be complex multicellular organisms like you and I. They're going to be smaller unicellular microorganisms such as yeast. Yeast are, in fact, considered to be eukaryotic, even though they're very similar to prokaryotic bacteria. All right, they do have some mitochondria. They do have a nucleus that contains their DNA. But since they're just unicellular organisms, they don't need as much ATP as you and I do as a multicellular organism. So they can survive without oxygen. All right, so they don't need to make 38 net ATP per glucose. They can survive off maybe just 2 ATP per glucose. But they would prefer to have oxygen present. All right, so again, that's just one example of a facultative aerobe. And we know yeast are used in a variety of different types of reactions, correct? Such as making alcohol, breads, baked goods, you name it. So as we proceed through the rest of this unit, we're going to first focus on obligate anaerobes and how they use glucose in the absence of oxygen to make ATP. That's the more simplistic version. But then as we proceed, we're going to learn about what we call aerobic cellular respiration and obligate aerobes like you and I that require oxygen to produce as much ATP as possible from one glucose molecule.